She was always there, quietly, gently, faithfully. The kind of presence you don't notice until it's gone. And he was too busy, too distracted, too caught up in the noise of running multiple businesses, chasing expectations, and outrunning the silence he carried inside. Until one day the world stopped. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. A phone call, a letter, a memory, a forgotten promise. And suddenly, the man who thought he had no time was forced to face the time he'd lost. What he finds when he finally stops running will shake him to his core. Subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after the screen fades to black. At 54, Elon Musk stood at the pinnacle of technological innovation, yet he felt as though he were drowning in his own success. The weight of multiple empires pressed down on his shoulders like an invisible mountain. Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, the Boring Company. Each name carried the hopes of thousands of employees, millions of investors, and billions of dollars in market value. But what they also carried was the relentless, suffocating pressure that had become his constant companion. Every morning began the same way. The alarm at 5:30. The immediate reach for his phone, already buzzing with urgent messages from 3 different continents. His fingers would dance across the screen, making decisions that would ripple through stock markets before most people had even opened their eyes. The coffee grew cold as he scrutinized production reports, questioned engineering choices, and demanded explanations for delays measured in hours, not days. He lived in the minutiae now. Where once he had dreamed of Mars colonies and sustainable energy futures, now he found himself obsessing over the precise angle of a door handle or the exact shade of a dashboard display. Nothing escaped his attention because everything, absolutely everything, could be the detail that made or broke a quarterly report. His employees had learned to fear his unexpected visits to the factory floor, where his sharp eyes would find the one bolt that wasn't perfectly aligned, the single wire that could be routed more efficiently. The personal toll was evident in every aspect of his fractured relationships. Saxon, his son, had become a stranger whose voice he barely recognized over the phone. Their scheduled Saturday visits had become casualties of crisis after crisis. Each canceled lunch, each postponed trip to the arcade, each missed soccer game added another layer to the wall growing between them. The boy's disappointed sighs through the phone had evolved into resigned acceptance, and somehow that silence hurt even more than the complaints. "Dad's working again," Saxon would say to his mother, and those 3 words carried the weight of a childhood shaped by absence. Grimes, beautiful and patient Grimes, tried to bridge the emotional chasm that had opened between them. At 34, she possessed an artist's sensitivity that seemed to amplify every instance of his emotional unavailability. She would find him at 3 in the morning, hunched over his laptop, the blue glow painting harsh shadows across his face. Her gentle touches on his shoulders were met with distracted murmurs, her attempts at meaningful conversation deflected by sudden urgent calls to Shanghai or Berlin. "You're disappearing," she had whispered to him just last week, her voice barely audible over the hum of his home office computers. But he hadn't really heard her. Not truly. The words had registered somewhere in his consciousness before being swept away by the tide of quarterly projections and production schedules. His treatment of employees had grown increasingly harsh, a reflection of impossible standards he set for himself. Meetings became battlegrounds where imperfection was met with surgical precision criticism. He demanded nothing less than excellence, but his definition of excellence had become so narrow, so unforgiving, that even his most dedicated team members walked away from interactions feeling diminished. The loyalty he commanded was born more from fear than inspiration now, and some part of him recognized this shift with growing unease. Time had become his enemy. There were never enough hours, never enough minutes to accomplish what needed to be done. He moved through his days with the desperate urgency of a man trying to outrun his own mortality, as if stopping for even a moment might allow the weight of all his responsibilities to finally crush him. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford. Meals were consumed while reviewing spreadsheets. Even bathroom breaks were opportunities to catch up on messages. The The phone calls from Sunset Manor had become increasingly frequent and increasingly ignored. His father's voice on the voicemail, strained with worry, speaking about his mother's deteriorating condition. Elon Musk, despite their complicated history, had become the unlikely guardian of family responsibility, trying desperately to bridge the gap between his ambitious son and his fading wife. "Elon, please. Your mother asked for you again today. She remembers you, son. She remembers your laugh." The messages piled up, unheard symphonies of familial obligation that he couldn't bring himself to face. Mae Musk, once a vibrant model and dietitian who had raised 3 children while building her own career, now resided in the fog of Alzheimer's disease. The woman who had encouraged his wildest dreams, who had supported his most impossible ambitions, was slowly disappearing into the labyrinth of her own mind. And he couldn't bear to watch it happen. The visits became less frequent, then sporadic, then non-existent. It was easier to send checks to ensure she had the best care money could buy than to sit beside her bed and watch her struggle to remember his name. His days blurred together in a kaleidoscope of high-stakes decisions and impossible deadlines. Television interviews where he performed the role of visionary genius while inside feeling increasingly hollow. Board meetings where millions of dollars hung on his every word. Factory tours where he smiled for cameras while his mind raced through 1,000 potential problems. The celebration of milestones had become meaningless rituals that stole precious time from productivity. Birthdays, anniversaries, achievements that others might savor were simply obstacles to overcome on the path to the next objective. He had trained himself to see emotional investments as inefficiencies, sentiment as weakness. But beneath the carefully constructed facade of relentless success, cracks were beginning to show. His reflection in the bathroom mirror revealed eyes that held too much weight, skin that had forgotten how to look rested. The man staring back at him seemed older than his years, worn down by the constant grinding of ambition against reality. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. Tesla's production line had experienced a critical malfunction, threatening to delay deliveries by weeks. As he stood in the factory, surrounded by the organized chaos of industrial production, something inside him simply snapped. The numbers on the clipboard blurred together, the voices of his engineers became distant echoes, and for the first time in years, Elon Musk felt utterly, completely overwhelmed. When Robert Downey Jr. appeared at his office that afternoon, it felt like a visitation from another lifetime. The actor's warm smile and casual confidence were relics from a time when Elon still believed in the romance of innovation, when success felt like joy rather than burden. Their conversation danced around the edges of deeper truths, both men recognizing the changes that time and fame had wrought. "Remember when we used to talk about changing the world for the fun of it?" Robert asked, his voice carrying the weight of shared history. But Elon could barely remember that young man, that dreamer who had once believed that reaching for the stars would feel like flying rather than falling. As Robert spoke of old dreams and forgotten laughter, something fundamental shifted inside him. The walls he had built, the armor he had worn, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. And then, as if his body had finally decided to surrender to what his mind refused to acknowledge, everything went dark. The last thing he saw was Robert's concerned face as the floor rushed up to meet him, and for the first time in years, Elon Musk was perfectly, completely still. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room was the first thing that penetrated Elon's consciousness as he drifted back into awareness. White walls, white sheets, white noise from machines that beeped with mechanical precision. His chest felt heavy, not just from the oxygen mask that had been placed over his face, but from something deeper, something that had been building for years and had finally demanded his attention in the most dramatic way possible. Dr. Sarah Chin stood beside his bed, her expression a careful balance of professional concern and gentle authority. She was perhaps 45, with kind eyes that had seen too many successful men brought low by their own ambitions. Her voice carried the weight of experience when she spoke, each word measured and deliberate. "Mr. Musk, you've had what we call a mild myocardial infarction. A heart attack. The words hung in the sterile air between them. Your body has been sending you signals for months, maybe years. This was your heart's way of demanding that you finally listen. She spoke of stress hormones and arterial pressure, of sleep deprivation, and the cumulative toll of chronic anxiety. But what Elon heard beneath her clinical explanations was something more fundamental. His body had betrayed him, or perhaps more accurately, he had betrayed his body. The machine he had pushed so relentlessly had finally pushed back. You need to make significant changes, Dr. Chen continued, her tone growing more serious. Not just in your diet or exercise routine, but in how you approach life itself. Your current pace isn't sustainable. Your heart is telling you that quite literally. Grimes arrived that evening, her usual ethereal composure cracked with worry. She moved to his bedside with the hesitant grace of someone approaching a wounded animal, unsure whether it might lash out or collapse entirely. Her fingers were cool against his forehead as she brushed away hair that had grown damp with perspiration. "You scared me," she whispered, and in those 3 words lay months of accumulated fear and frustration. "I thought I was going to lose you before I ever really had you." But even as she spoke, even as her eyes searched his face for some sign of the transformation that near-death experiences were supposed to bring, Elon found himself mentally cataloging the messages that must be piling up on his phone. Tesla's stock price. The SpaceX launch scheduled for next month. The meeting with investors that he was now going to miss. "It's just a warning shot," he told her, his voice rougher than usual from the oxygen tube. "I'll be fine. Back to work in a few days." The disappointment that flickered across her features was brief but unmistakable. She had hoped that this moment might crack open the emotional fortress he had built around himself, but already she could see him rebuilding the walls even from his hospital bed. Elon Musk's visit was awkward in the way that only family visits can be. The older man stood stiffly near the window, his hands clasped behind his back as if he were inspecting a piece of machinery rather than checking on his son's recovery. Their conversation was a careful dance around deeper feelings, both men too proud and too wounded by years of complicated history to speak what was really in their hearts. "Your mother asks about you," Errol said finally, the words carrying more weight than they should have. "Every day, she asks when you're coming to see her." But even this gentle reproach was met with deflection, with explanations about recovery time and work obligations that both men knew were excuses for something more fundamental. In the quiet hours between visitors, something began to shift inside Elon's chest that had nothing to do with his cardiac recovery. The absence of constant stimulation, the forced stillness of his hospital bed, created space for thoughts he had been outrunning for years. When had he last felt genuine joy? When had he last laughed without calculating the time it cost him? When had he last looked at another person and felt truly connected rather than simply transactionally engaged? Robert Downey Jr.'s second appearance felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. The actor arrived with his characteristic blend of warmth and irreverence, carrying coffee that smelled like real life and stories that reminded Elon of who he used to be. There was something infectious about Robert's presence, a lightness that seemed to fill the sterile hospital room with possibilities. "You know," Robert said, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair with the ease of someone comfortable in his own skin, "I've been thinking about something you said years ago. About how the best ideas come when you're not trying so hard to have them." The conversation meandered through memories of late-night conversations about changing the world, about the romance of innovation, about the time when building the future felt like play rather than punishment. And for brief moments, Elon caught glimpses of that younger version of himself, the dreamer who had believed that reaching for Mars would feel like joy rather than burden. It was Robert who finally convinced him to visit Sunset Manor, though the actor's persuasion was gentle rather than forceful. "She's still your mother," he said simply. "Alzheimer's might have stolen her memories, but it hasn't stolen the love." The drive to the care facility felt like traveling through time. Elon sat in the passenger seat of his Tesla Model S, watching familiar landscapes blur past while his mind raced between anticipation and dread. He hadn't seen May in 8 months, and the guilt of that absence sat heavy in his chest, competing with his recovering heart for space. May Musk looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile, as if the disease had not just affected her mind, but had somehow diminished her physical presence as well. She sat by the window in the facility's common room, her once sharp eyes now soft with confusion, her hands folded in her lap, like a child waiting for instructions. When he approached, she looked up with polite interest but no recognition. The woman who had once been his greatest champion, who had supported his wildest dreams when everyone else called them impossible, now regarded him as a kind stranger. "Hello," she said softly, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone trying to navigate a world that no longer made complete sense. "Are you here to visit someone?" The pain of that moment was sharper than any chest discomfort he had experienced in the hospital. This was his mother, the woman who had shaped his earliest understanding of possibility and determination, and she no longer knew his face. Later, as he sat with Errol in the facilities garden, his father mentioned something that caught him completely off guard. "You know, I've been thinking," the older man said, his voice carrying an unusual vulnerability. "I'd like to marry your mother again. In a church this time, with you and your siblings there. Before." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung between them like morning fog. Elon's reaction was immediate and harsh. "What's the point?" The words came out sharper than he intended, driven by frustration and a kind of angry practicality. "She doesn't even remember being married to you the first time. She doesn't remember any of us." But even as he spoke, something in his father's expression made him pause. There was hope there, fragile and stubborn, the kind of hope that persists despite all evidence to the contrary. The deterioration of his relationship with Grimes accelerated after his return home. She wanted more from him, more presence, more emotional availability, more of the connection that she had been craving for months. But he found himself unable to give what she needed, unable to bridge the gap between his intellectual understanding of her requests and his actual capacity for emotional intimacy. "I feel like I'm in love with a ghost," she told him during one of their increasingly frequent arguments. "You're here, but you're not really here. Even your near-death experience could wake you up." Robert's visits became more frequent, as if the actor sensed that his friend was standing at some kind of crossroads. He would arrive unannounced, bringing stories from film sets and tales of creative collaboration that highlighted everything that was missing from Elon's current existence. There was something about Robert's spontaneous joy, his ability to find genuine pleasure in small moments, that both inspired and irritated Elon in equal measure. "Remember when you used to get excited about impossible things?" Robert asked during one visit, his tone carefully casual. Not because they were profitable or efficient, but because they were beautiful. The question lingered long after Robert had left, echoing through the hollow spaces of Elon's carefully constructed life. Even his visits to the Tesla factory began to feel different, as if he were observing his own life from a distance. The familiar sounds of production, the controlled chaos of innovation, the dedication of his team, all of it felt somehow foreign, as if he were visiting someone else's dream rather than living his own. The final blow came in the form of an unexpected phone call from his lawyers. A major Chinese automotive consortium had made an offer to acquire Tesla, a sum so substantial that it would solve every financial pressure and set him free from the daily grind of automotive manufacturing forever. As he sat in his home office that evening, holding the formal offer letter, Elon found himself reaching for something he hadn't touched in years. The family photo album, leather-bound and gathering dust, filled with images from a time when life had felt full of possibility rather than obligation. He turned the pages slowly, studying faces that seemed to belong to characters in someone else's story. There was May, vibrant and laughing, holding a much younger version of himself. There were family gatherings, celebrations, moments of pure joy captured in fading color photographs. And as he sat there, surrounded by the trappings of his incredible success, Elon Musk realized that somewhere along the way, he had gained the whole world but lost something infinitely more precious. The question that remained was whether it was too late to find his way back. Before we go on, can I ask you something? Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know how far this story has reached. Elon Musk had always been a man of stubborn persistence, but in recent weeks, that persistence had taken on an almost sacred quality. He would arrive at Elon's office unannounced, his weathered hands clutching old photographs and faded documents, his eyes bright with a determination that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. "It was a promise I made to her 40 years ago," he said, settling into the leather chair across from Elon's desk without invitation. His voice carried the weight of decades, each word carefully measured as if he were presenting evidence in a court of law. "We were so young, so focused on survival and building something from nothing. I told her we'd have a proper wedding someday in a church with all the ceremony and beauty she deserved." The documents he spread across the polished surface were yellowed with age. Marriage certificates, immigration papers, photographs of a young couple who looked nothing like the people they had become. There was May, radiant in a simple dress, her smile so brilliant it seemed to illuminate the entire black and white photograph. And there was Errol, impossibly young, his arm around her waist with a protective tenderness that spoke of promises yet to be fulfilled. "We had a civil ceremony," Errol continued, his finger tracing the edge of an old photograph. "Quick, practical, efficient. But she always dreamed of walking down an aisle in white, of exchanging vows before God, of having our children there to witness something beautiful." Elon listened with the detached attention he typically reserved for quarterly reports, his mind automatically calculating the logistics and costs of such a gesture. To him, it seemed like an elaborate exercise in nostalgia, a romantic notion that ignored the harsh reality of his mother's condition. What was the point of a ceremony she wouldn't remember? What meaning could there be in vows exchanged with someone who no longer recognized the person making them? "Dad, she has Alzheimer's," he said, his tone carrying the same clinical precision he used in board meetings. "She doesn't remember being married to you the first time. She doesn't remember me half the time." But Errol's response surprised him with its quiet strength. "Love isn't just about memory, son. It's about honoring what was, celebrating what is, and believing in something greater than what we can see." When Robert Downey Jr. learned about Errol's plan, his reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. He found Elon in his home office late one evening, surrounded by the familiar glow of multiple computer screens, his fingers dancing across keyboards with mechanical precision. "Your father's idea is beautiful," Robert said without preamble, dropping into the chair beside Elon's desk. "It's the most romantic thing I've heard in years. And you're treating it like a business proposal." Robert's presence had a way of making the sterile environment of Elon's office feel suddenly warm and alive. The actor possessed an emotional intelligence that cut through pretense and corporate speak, speaking directly to the human heart that Elon had been trying so hard to silence. "Think about it," Robert continued, his voice taking on the passionate cadence that had made him such a compelling screen presence. "Here's a man who wants to marry the love of his life for the second time, not because he has to, but because he chooses to, even though she might not remember it. Especially because she might not remember it. That's not nostalgia, my friend. That's faith." Meanwhile, Errol had begun making daily visits to Sunset Manor with a devotion that bordered on ritual. He would arrive each morning at 10 o'clock precisely, carrying small gifts that spoke of deep attention to detail. Fresh flowers that matched the colors she had always loved. Photographs of places they had visited together. Sometimes just his presence, sitting beside her chair in comfortable silence while she gazed out the window at gardens she no longer recognized. Elon found himself watching these interactions with growing fascination. His father, whom he had always seen as pragmatic to the point of emotional detachment, had transformed into something approaching a poet. Errol would speak to May as if she were completely present, telling her about their children's accomplishments, sharing memories of their early years together, describing plans for a future that existed more in hope than in reality. "You look beautiful today, my dear," Errol would say, his voice soft with genuine tenderness. Just like the day I first saw you at that coffee shop in Pretoria. And sometimes miraculously May would smile. Not with recognition exactly, but with the unconscious response to love that transcends memory and speaks directly to the soul. The final dissolution of his relationship with Grimes came on a Tuesday afternoon that had started like any other. She had arrived at his office with the careful composure of someone who had rehearsed difficult words, her artistic sensibilities evident in the way she had chosen her outfit, her makeup, even the time of day for maximum emotional impact. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened at the corners of her eyes. "I've been trying to love a man who's forgotten how to be present, how to be vulnerable, how to be human." Their conversation was brief and devastating in its efficiency. She spoke of emotional availability and authentic connection while he responded with platitudes about timing and professional obligations. Even as she walked away, even as he watched her gather her few belongings from his space, Elon found himself mentally reviewing his afternoon schedule rather than processing the magnitude of what he was losing. His attempts to reconnect with Saxon proved equally futile. The boy had learned to protect himself from disappointment by expecting nothing, and Elon's sudden interest in father-son activities was met with polite but distant responses. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations were declined with carefully diplomatic excuses delivered through intermediaries. The loneliness that followed was different from anything Elon had experienced before. It wasn't the solitude of focused work or the isolation of leadership responsibility. This was the hollow ache of a man who had systematically dismantled every meaningful relationship in his life in pursuit of some abstract notion of success. It was Robert who finally convinced him to accompany Errol on one of his daily visits to the care facility. "You don't have to say anything," the actor assured him. "Just be there. Sometimes presence is the only gift that matters." The drive to Sunset Manor felt like a pilgrimage. Elon sat in the passenger seat of his father's modest sedan, watching the familiar landscape blur past while classical music played softly from a radio. Errol hummed along occasionally, his weathered hands steady on the steering wheel, his expression peaceful in a way that Elon envied. The moment that changed everything came without warning or fanfare. May was sitting in her usual spot by the window, her silver hair catching the afternoon light, her hands folded in her lap with characteristic grace. She looked up as they approached, her eyes moving past Errol to settle on Elon's face with sudden intensity. "Elon," she whispered, her voice barely audible but unmistakably clear. "My brilliant boy." The recognition lasted only seconds before her expression softened back into gentle confusion, but those seconds contained a lifetime of love. In that brief moment of clarity, Elon saw himself reflected in his mother's eyes not as a CEO or innovator or public figure, but simply as her son. The tears that followed came without permission, silent streams that he tried unsuccessfully to hide. Later, as the three men sat in the facility's garden sharing stories and memories, something fundamental shifted in the dynamic between them. Robert spoke of the early days of their friendship, when dreams felt achievable and the future stretched ahead like an open road. Errol shared memories of a family home in South Africa, describing Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations with the detailed affection of someone who had learned to treasure such moments. "Remember the Christmas when you built that rocket in the backyard?" Robert asked, his laughter infectious and warm. "You were so determined to reach the moon that you nearly burned down the neighbor's fence." "You still have that look in your eyes sometimes," Errol added quietly, "when you talk about Mars or sustainable energy. It's the same expression you had as a boy when you believed anything was possible." For the first time in years, Elon allowed himself to sit with these memories rather than rushing past them toward the next objective. There was something healing in the recognition that he had once been a child who dreamed without calculating return on investment, who reached for impossible things simply because they were beautiful. The decision to support his father's wedding plan came not through logical analysis, but through something deeper and more intuitive. "Let's do it," he said suddenly, interrupting a comfortable silence that had settled over their small group. Let's give her the wedding she always wanted. Errol's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The older man's eyes filled with tears as he reached across the table to grasp his son's hand, his grip strong despite his advancing years. "You mean it? You'll help me plan everything?" More than that, Elon heard himself saying, the words surprising him with their spontaneity. "We'll make it perfect. Every detail, every moment, exactly as she would have wanted it." Robert's offer to serve as master of ceremonies added another layer of meaning to the growing plan. "I've always wanted to marry off my best friend's parents," he said with characteristic humor that masked deeper emotion. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you two don't turn this into a corporate event." The chapter's final image was simple but profound in its symbolism. Elon stood in the flower shop he had driven past countless times but never entered, surrounded by blooms in every color imaginable. The elderly florist watched with patient kindness as he studied each arrangement with the same intensity he typically reserved for engineering specifications. "They're for my mother," he told her finally, selecting white roses with baby's breath, flowers that spoke of purity and enduring love. "She's getting married." As he carried the arrangement to his car, Elon realized that for the first time in years, he was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or production schedules. He was anticipating a moment of pure human connection, and the feeling was both terrifying and wonderful. The transformation began in the most unlikely of places. Elon's corporate office, usually a sterile temple to efficiency and profit margins, suddenly bloomed with fabric swatches and flower catalogs. His executive assistant, Maria, watched in amazement as the man who typically dismissed anything that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets spent an entire afternoon debating the emotional resonance of different shades of cream for tablecloths. "It needs to feel warm," he said, holding up samples against the natural light streaming through his office windows. "Not corporate warm, but home warm. Like the kitchen table where she used to make us breakfast." The venue selection had been surprisingly simple. Café Botanica, a small restaurant tucked away in a historic district, possessed exactly the intimate charm that Elon suddenly realized he had been missing in his grand, impersonal spaces. The owner, Mrs. Chun, was a woman in her 60s whose eyes crinkled with genuine delight when Elon explained his vision. "A second wedding for your parents?" she asked, her accent carrying the musical cadence of someone who had learned English as a love letter to her adopted country. "After all these years, this is the most beautiful thing I have heard in months." Within hours, Café Botanica had transformed from a business arrangement into a community project. The staff, initially intimidated by Elon's reputation and presence, gradually warmed to the gentleness they discovered beneath his typically stern exterior. Miguel, the head chef, found himself in lengthy discussions about May's favorite foods from decades past. Sarah, the young waitress who usually worked weekend shifts, volunteered to stay late every evening to help with decorations. "You know, Mr. Musk," Miguel said, wiping flour from his hands as he emerged from the kitchen, "my grandmother always said that food tastes better when it's made with stories. Tell me more about your mother's smile, and I'll make sure every bite carries that memory." This version of Elon was a revelation to everyone who encountered him. Gone was the sharp-edged executive who measured every interaction in terms of efficiency and outcome. In his place emerged a son who asked questions about flower meanings, who listened carefully to suggestions from people he would have previously dismissed as irrelevant to his concerns. Word of the unusual celebration spread through their circle with the gentle persistence of morning light. Neighbors who had known the family during happier times reached out with offers of help and stories they wanted to share. Old friends from South Africa sent messages of support across oceans and decades. Even business associates, initially puzzled by this sudden display of sentimentality from the famously pragmatic entrepreneur, found themselves unexpectedly moved by the gesture. The dress shopping expedition required careful orchestration. May's confusion made traditional bridal appointments impossible, so Elon arranged for a boutique owner to bring a selection of simple, elegant gowns to Sunset Manor. The facility's common room was transformed into an impromptu fitting area, complete with proper lighting, and a full-length mirror borrowed from the administrative offices. May's response to the white dresses was magical to witness. Even in her fog of confusion, something deep and instinctual responded to the ritual of trying on wedding gowns. Her posture straightened, her movements became more graceful, and for brief, precious moments, her eyes held flashes of the bride she had once been and was about to become again. "Beautiful," she murmured, touching the delicate lace on one dress with fingers that seemed to remember the texture of dreams. "So beautiful." The inclusion of Saxon as ring bearer marked the beginning of something precious and fragile between father and son. The boy, now 13 and protective of his own heart, initially approached the role with the careful distance he had learned to maintain around his father's unpredictable attention. "Why is this important to you?" Saxon asked during one of their planning sessions, his young voice carrying a wisdom that spoke of too much adult disappointment experienced too early. Elon found himself without his usual arsenal of logical explanations. Instead, he spoke from a place he rarely accessed, even in private moments. Because sometimes the most important things we do aren't about success or achievement. Sometimes they're just about love. The invitation to Grimes had been extended with trembling fingers dialing her number, his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with cardiac recovery and everything to do with the vulnerability of reaching towards someone he had pushed away. "I know I have no right to ask," he said when she answered, his voice lacking its typical corporate confidence. "But it would mean something to have you there. Not as my girlfriend, not as anything other than someone who knew me when I still remembered how to dream about impossible things." Her silence stretched across the phone line like a bridge that might hold their weight or might collapse entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone protecting herself from renewed disappointment. "I'll think about it," she said, and in those 4 words, Elon heard both hope and the echo of all the ways he had failed her. The conversation with Robert that truly changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in the actor's Malibu home. They sat on the deck overlooking the Pacific, sharing a bottle of wine that Robert had been saving for a special occasion, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of forgiveness. "I've spent my entire adult life building a future that I thought would make me happy," Elon said, his words carried away by the ocean breeze. "And I managed to destroy everything that actually did make me happy along the way." Robert's response was immediate and characteristically direct. "So stop building the future for 5 minutes and start living the present. This wedding isn't about your parents, Elon. It's about you remembering how to be human." The guests who gathered at Cafe Botanica represented decades of connection that Elon had allowed to grow dusty with neglect. Colleagues who had worked with Errol in his engineering days. Neighbors from the old family home who remembered May's dinner parties and holiday celebrations. Even a few employees from Elon's companies who had been touched by his unexpected vulnerability during the planning process. Mrs. Patterson, May's former neighbor, arrived early with a photo album filled with images of community barbecues and birthday parties, moments when a Musk family had been simply one household among many, defined by love rather than achievement. "Your mother made the most beautiful cakes," she told Elon, pointing to a photograph of May laughing while frosting a birthday creation. "Not perfect, you understand, but made with such joy that they tasted like happiness itself." May's preparation for the ceremony was handled with the tender care typically reserved for newborns or priceless artifacts. The staff at Sunset Manor had worked with Sarah, the young waitress from the cafe, to create a gentle beauty routine that honored May's dignity while accommodating her confusion. When Elon arrived to escort her to the ceremony, he found his mother sitting in her wheelchair, wearing the simple cream-colored dress they had chosen together. Her silver hair had been arranged in a soft style that echoed photographs from her youth, and someone had applied just enough makeup to bring color to her cheeks without masking her natural beauty. "You look radiant, Mom," he said, the word mom feeling foreign and familiar on his tongue simultaneously. Her response was a smile that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory, somewhere that disease couldn't touch. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of simple elegance. Robert, resplendent in a suit that managed to be both formal and approachable, stood at the makeshift altar with the confidence of someone who understood that the most important performances happen off-screen. "We gather today," he began, his voice carrying the perfect blend of gravitas and warmth, "not to witness a beginning, but to celebrate a love that has endured through decades, through challenges, through changes that would have defeated lesser hearts." As Elon wheeled his mother down the brief aisle between tables decorated with white roses and baby's breath, he was acutely aware of every face turned toward them. Saxon, looking impossibly grown-up in his small tuxedo, clutched the rings with serious concentration. Grimes, who had arrived at the last moment, sat in the back row with tears already glistening in her eyes. The moment that would replay in Elon's memory for the rest of his life came when May looked up at Errol, standing handsome and nervous in his best suit, and her face transformed with sudden, brilliant recognition. "Errol," she said, her voice clear and strong, "you kept your promise." The vows they exchanged were simple, spoken in voices that carried the weight of decades and the hope of whatever time remained. Errol spoke of promises kept and love renewed. May, in her moments of clarity, responded with words that seemed to come from the deepest parts of her heart. When they were pronounced husband and wife for the second time, the applause that erupted was more than celebration. It was release, joy, and the collective recognition that they had all witnessed something sacred and rare. And through it all, Elon stood silently, watching his parents embrace, feeling something long frozen in his chest begin to thaw. For the first time in years, he understood that the most valuable things in life couldn't be quantified, couldn't be optimized, couldn't be rushed or improved or made more efficient. They could only be cherished. The morning after the wedding, Elon woke to a silence he hadn't experienced in decades. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. The familiar anxiety that typically greeted him before his eyes even opened had been replaced by something unprecedented in his adult life: contentment. He lay in bed for an extra 10 minutes, watching dust motes dance in the streams of sunlight filtering through his bedroom windows, marveling at how such a simple sight could feel like revelation. The Chinese consortium's offer still sat on his desk, surrounded by legal documents and financial projections that painted a picture of freedom from corporate responsibility. But when he looked at those papers now, they seemed to represent not liberation, but surrender. The numbers that had once danced with possibility now felt flat and lifeless, lacking the human warmth he had rediscovered at his parents' wedding. "Cancel the meeting with Beijing," he told his assistant Maria, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised them both. "Tell them we're postponing indefinitely." The Tesla factory floor looked different through his changed perspective. Where once he had seen inefficiencies and problems demanding immediate correction, he now noticed the quiet pride his employees took in their work, the collaborative spirit that emerged when they were trusted to solve problems rather than simply execute commands. "James," he said to his production manager, a man who had weathered countless storms of Elon's impatience over the years, "what would you change if you could run this place for a month?" The question hung in the air like morning fog, beautiful and unexpected. James, a veteran engineer with calloused hands and sharp eyes, took a moment to process this unprecedented invitation to share his vision. "More time for training," he said finally, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Less rushing between crises. The team knows what they're doing, Mr. Musk. They just need space to do it right." The conversation that followed was unlike any Elon had experienced in his corporate life. Instead of dictating solutions, he found himself listening, really listening, to ideas that had been waiting years for permission to be voiced. The relief in James's expression was almost painful to witness, a reminder of how many valuable perspectives he had silenced in his relentless pursuit of control. Saxon's surprise when his father appeared at the school pickup line was worth every rearranged meeting and postponed call. The boy approached the car with the cautious hope of someone who had learned not to expect too much but couldn't help dreaming anyway. "Dad." Saxon's voice carried the tentative quality of someone testing whether this new reality might actually be sustainable. "You're really here." The drive home became a treasure hunt of conversation. Elon found himself asking questions he had never thought to ask before. What did Saxon think about during math class? Which friends made him laugh? What dreams visited him at night when the world grew quiet and possibilities felt infinite? "I want to be an astronaut," Saxon admitted, his 13-year-old voice carrying the same mixture of ambition and vulnerability that had once characterized his father's impossible dreams. "Like the people you're sending to Mars." The meeting with Grimes happened by accident, as the most meaningful encounters often do. Elon was leaving a small bookstore in Venice Beach, his arms full of children's books about space exploration he planned to read with Saxon, when he spotted her familiar silhouette browsing the philosophy section. Their eyes met across the narrow aisle, and for a moment, the months of hurt and misunderstanding seemed to dissolve like morning mist. She looked beautiful in the way that only someone who has learned to exist independently can look, carrying herself with a grace that spoke of hard-won self-possession. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than entire speeches he had delivered to packed auditoriums. "For seeing something in me worth loving, even when I couldn't see it myself." Her smile was sad and knowing, the expression of someone who had learned to find peace with incomplete stories. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Elon. I really do." They parted with the gentle finality of people who had loved each other but couldn't save each other, and Elon was surprised to discover that this ending felt more like forgiveness than failure. Robert's theatrical proposal arrived with characteristic flair and unexpected timing. The actor appeared at Elon's office one afternoon with a leather-bound notebook filled with scene outlines and character sketches, his eyes bright with creative enthusiasm. "I want to tell your family's story," he announced, settling into the chair across from Elon's desk as if he belonged there. Not the corporate biography version, but the real story. Love and ambition, dreams and regrets, the price of reaching for impossible things. Working with Robert on the script became a form of archaeology, excavating memories that Elon had buried beneath decades of achievement and ambition. Late-night writing sessions in Robert's Malibu study revealed stories that had been waiting years to be told. Family dinners where young Elon had shared his plans to change the world, quiet moments when his mother had listened to his fears about never being good enough, conversations with his father about the weight of dreams and the courage required to pursue them. "This scene," Robert said, pointing to a passage about Christmas morning in South Africa, "this is where we see who you were before you decided who you had to become." The writing process became a form of therapy, forcing Elon to confront not just what had happened in his life, but how those events had shaped the man he had chosen to become. For the first time, he began to understand that his relentless drive had been as much about running from a boy who feared he might not be special as it had been about running toward the future he wanted to create. Errol's sudden illness arrived like a storm on a clear day, unexpected and devastating in its swiftness. The call came at 2 in the morning, Elon's phone piercing the darkness with news that his father had collapsed at home and been rushed to the hospital. Driving through empty streets toward the medical center, Elon found himself experiencing a fear he hadn't felt since childhood, the terror of losing someone before all the important things had been said. The conversations they had never had, the forgiveness they had never exchanged, the love they had never learned how to express properly, all of it seemed to hang in the balance as he raced through red lights toward uncertainty. The hospital corridors smelled of disinfectant and possibility, that peculiar mixture of ending and hope that characterizes places where life makes its most dramatic decisions. Errol lay small and pale in intensive care bed, machines monitoring the rhythm of a heart that had worked so hard for so many years. "I'm here, Dad," Elon whispered, taking his father's weathered hand in his own. "I'm not going anywhere." The days that followed revealed dimensions of himself that Elon had forgotten existed. He became, for the first time in his adult life, simply a son caring for his parent. He learned the rhythms of hospital life, shift changes and visiting hours, the language of medical updates, and the politics of bedside vigils. When Father Miguel arrived to offer last rites, Elon didn't protest as he might have in the past. Instead, he He stood quietly beside the bed, watching the gentle priest perform rituals that spoke to something deeper than logic or efficiency. The blessing carried weight that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with human connection to something larger than individual ambition. Saxon's presence at the hospital transformed both grandfather and grandson. The boy approached Errol's bedside with the fearless tenderness that only children possess, chattering about school and friends and dreams while his grandfather's eyes tracked every word with desperate attention. "Tell me about the Mars rockets, Grandpa," Saxon would say, his young voice filling the sterile room with warmth. "Dad says you helped him understand how machines could dream." These conversations, simple and profound, reminded Elon that legacy lived not in quarterly reports or stock prices, but in the stories passed between generations, the dreams shared across decades, the love that persisted even when words grew difficult. The pace of his days changed fundamentally during this period. Where once he had measured time in meetings and deadlines, he now found himself marking hours by his father's breathing, by Saxon's laughter, by the subtle changes in light that marked dawn and dusk in hospital windows. His Tesla employees, initially concerned about his absence, gradually adapted to his new rhythm with surprising grace. Maria learned to prioritize calls based on genuine urgency rather than perceived importance. James and his team discovered they could make decisions that had previously required Elon's direct approval. The company didn't collapse, it evolved. "You seem different," Maria observed during one of his brief office visits. "Calmer, more present." The observation was accurate, but incomplete. Elon hadn't just become calmer, he had become more human. The edges that had once defined his interactions with the world had softened, allowing for connections he had previously considered inefficient or irrelevant. Walking through his childhood neighborhood with Saxon became a form of pilgrimage. They visited the house where he had built his first computer, the school where he had first dreamed of space travel, the library where he had discovered that books could transport him to any future he could imagine. "This is where your grandmother taught me to see beyond what existed to what could be," he told Saxon as they stood outside his elementary school. She said the most important question wasn't why, but why not? The letter to his mother emerged from this newfound understanding of memory's power. Sitting at his kitchen table with a pen and paper instead of his usual keyboard and screen, Elon wrote not to the woman May had become, but to the mother who lived in his heart unchanged by time or disease. "Dear Mom," he began, his handwriting careful and deliberate. "I want to tell you about the man I'm learning to become, and how much of him comes from the boy you raised to believe in impossible things." When he finished, the letter was 3 pages long, filled with gratitude and apology, memory and hope. He folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope addressed simply to "the woman who taught me to dream." Watching May hold the letter at Sunset Manor, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting even though the words might no longer make complete sense, Elon felt something settle in his chest. She couldn't read it aloud, couldn't discuss its contents, couldn't even acknowledge that she understood its significance. But she smiled. And for the first time in years, Elon smiled back without calculating the time it cost him. The idea of transforming private pain into public art terrified and thrilled Elon in equal measure. Standing in Robert's cluttered Malibu study, surrounded by stacks of script revisions and costume sketches, he felt the familiar sensation of approaching a precipice, that moment when vision becomes vulnerable to reality. "Are you sure about this?" he asked Robert for the 20th time in as many days. "Putting our family story on stage for everyone to see." Robert looked up from a typewriter where he had been crafting dialogue that captured the essence of their shared memories. His eyes held the patient wisdom of someone who understood that the most meaningful art emerges from the willingness to be completely, terrifyingly honest. "The stories that change people are the ones that feel true," Robert replied, his voice carrying the conviction of years spent inhabiting other people's lives. "Your story, our story. It's about the price of dreams and the courage to love anyway. That's universal, Elon. That's why it matters." The script had evolved beyond Robert's initial vision into something more collaborative and complex. Scenes about Tesla's early struggles were interwoven with intimate family moments, May teaching young Elon to see failure as education, Arrow working late nights to support his family's impossible dreams, the quiet Sunday mornings when the future felt both infinite and achievable. When word spread through Tesla's headquarters about the theatrical project, the response was unprecedented. Maria, his assistant, volunteered to handle costume coordination. James from production offered to build sets with the same precision he brought to automotive assembly lines. Even the cafeteria staff asked if they could cater the opening night, wanting to be part of something that celebrated not just their workplace, but the human story behind it. "It's like you've given us permission to care about more than quarterly targets," Maria observed during one planning meeting. "We want to be part of telling this story because it's our story too." The most unexpected development was Saxon's enthusiasm for the project. The boy who had grown cautious around his father's attention threw himself into the rehearsal process with uninhibited joy, revealing a natural theatrical instinct that surprised everyone, including himself. "Dad, listen to this," Saxon said one evening, practicing his lines in their living room. He had been cast as young Elon, and his portrayal captured not just the ambition, but the vulnerability of a boy who dreamed of changing the world because he couldn't quite figure out how to fit into the one that already existed. Working on scenes together became a form of archaeology for both father and son. Elon found himself sharing stories he had never thought to tell. The loneliness of being different, the weight of others' expectations, the fear that maybe his dreams were too big for reality to accommodate. "Were you scared?" Saxon asked during one writing session, his 13-year-old eyes serious with newfound understanding. "Terrified," Elon admitted, the honesty feeling both dangerous and liberating. "Every single day. But your grandmother taught me that being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means doing the important things anyway." Errol's attendance at rehearsals became a daily ritual that marked his gradual recovery from his health scare. Though still frail, he would arrive each afternoon with the punctuality of someone who had learned not to take such moments for granted. His presence added an unexpected layer of authenticity to the performances, as actors found themselves adjusting their portrayals based on his gentle corrections and shared memories. No, he would say with good-natured authority, May never stirred the tea that way. She had a special rhythm, like she was conducting music only she could hear. The decision to bring May to watch a rehearsal required careful planning and gentle preparation. The staff at Sunset Manor worked with the production team to create an environment that would feel welcoming rather than overwhelming. They chose a quiet afternoon scene, one filled with warmth and familiar music from her youth. When the actress portraying young May began singing a lullaby in Afrikaans, something magical happened. May's expression shifted from polite confusion to something approaching recognition, not of the specific moment being portrayed, but of the emotion it contained. She began humming along, her voice soft but clear, adding an unscripted harmony that left everyone in the rehearsal space transfixed. "Beautiful," she whispered when the scene ended, her eyes bright with tears she didn't understand. "So beautiful." Robert's direction balanced humor and pathos with the skill of someone who understood that the deepest truths often emerge through laughter. He encouraged the actors to find the comedy in their characters' earnestness, the absurdity in their certainty, the humanity in their failures. Elon at 25 thought he could revolutionize transportation by Tuesday, Robert told the actor playing his younger self. "That's not arrogance, that's the beautiful delusion of someone who hasn't learned to be practical yet." The revelation of Saxon's natural theatrical talent became a source of unexpected pride and concern for Elon. The boy inhabited his roles with an emotional honesty that was both impressive and slightly heartbreaking, as if he were processing his own relationship with his father through the safety of performance. "He's got real gift," Robert observed after a particularly moving rehearsal. "The question is whether you'll encourage it or try to redirect him towards something more traditionally successful." The Tesla Auditorium had been transformed into an intimate theater space, with lighting that softened the industrial edges and seating arrangements that encouraged connection rather than corporate distance. The guest list had evolved organically, including not just employees and investors, but neighbors, old friends, and even some former competitors who had heard about the unusual project. Opening night arrived with the nervous energy that accompanies all meaningful risks. Elon stood backstage, adjusting Saxon's costume and fighting the urge to cancel the entire production. The vulnerability of having his family's story interpreted and shared felt more overwhelming than any product launch or investor presentation he had ever faced. "What if they don't understand?" he asked Robert, his voice betraying an uncertainty that rarely surfaced in his public persona. "Then they don't understand," Robert replied with characteristic calm. "But what if they do? What if seeing your story helps them make sense of their own?" The performance unfolded with an intimacy that surprised everyone involved. The audience, initially uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented glimpse behind the corporate veil, gradually surrendered to the emotional authenticity of what they were witnessing. Laughter and tears flowed with equal freedom, creating the kind of shared experience that transforms strangers into temporary family. During the scene depicting May and Errol's second wedding, the real couple sat in the front row, Errol's hand covering May's as she watched actors portray their love story with reverent care. The applause that followed wasn't just appreciation for performance, it was celebration of love itself in all its imperfect, persistent glory. The reception afterward felt more like a family reunion than a corporate event. Old rivals approached Elon with unexpected warmth, sharing their own stories of family struggle and professional sacrifice. Employees who had worked alongside him for years revealed personal details they had never thought to share, creating connections that transcended their professional relationships. "I never knew," said Dr. Martinez, Tesla's head of engineering, her eyes still bright with tears from the performance. "I never knew you carried all of that while you were pushing us to be our best." Saxon's post-performance energy was infectious, his excitement about the audience's response revealing a side of himself that Elon had never seen. The boy glowed with the particular satisfaction that comes from meaningful accomplishment, from using one's gifts to create something beautiful. "Dad," Saxon said, still in his costume, his young face animated with joy, "I've never seen you look so happy. Like really happy, not just successful happy." Errol's gratitude expressed itself in the trembling embrace he offered his son after the curtain call. "You came home," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "After all these years, you finally came home." Standing in the transformed auditorium as the last guests departed, Elon experienced a revelation that reorganized his understanding of everything he had built. Tesla had never been just about electric vehicles or sustainable energy or revolutionary transportation. It had been about creating something worthy of the dreams his mother had nurtured, something that honored the sacrifices his father had made, something that justified the faith of everyone who had believed in impossible things. Robert's success that evening extended beyond directorial achievement. Several audience members approached him with offers for future projects, recognizing that his ability to find the universal within the personal represented a rare and valuable talent. "You've started something here," one prominent theater producer told him. "This kind of honest storytelling, this willingness to make corporate spaces human, there's a hunger for it." The decision to convert part of the Tesla factory into a permanent cultural space emerged naturally from the evening's success. As Elon walked through the facility the next morning, he could envision areas where art and industry might coexist, where the people who built the future might also celebrate the stories that shaped their past. The chapter's final image captured something precious and rare: father and son working together to close down the auditorium, their laughter echoing through the space as they stacked chairs and gathered forgotten programs. Saxon made jokes about his stage debut, while Elon found himself genuinely enjoying the mundane task of cleaning up, discovering that even the endings of meaningful events could carry their own form of joy. "Can we do this again sometime?" Saxon asked as they turned off the lights. "As often as you want," Elon replied, and for the first time in years, he meant it completely. The recognition came gradually, like dawn breaking over a familiar landscape. Marcus Henderson stood in the Tesla showroom, his weathered hands tracing the sleek lines of a Model S with the reverence of someone touching a sacred artifact. He was perhaps 60 now, his hair silver and his posture bearing the careful dignity of someone who had learned to carry both triumph and loss with equal grace. "Mr. Musk," he said when Elon approached, his voice carrying the warm formality of someone addressing a figure from their youth. "I don't expect you to remember me, but I bought one of your first roadsters back in 2008. Changed my entire life." The conversation that followed opened a door Elon hadn't known existed. Marcus spoke of being a young engineer, struggling with student loans and uncertain about his future when he had scraped together enough money to purchase that early Tesla. The car had become more than transportation. It had been proof that impossible things could become real, that the future could arrive ahead of schedule if someone was brave enough to build it. "I took that car to job interviews, to my wedding, to the hospital when my daughter was born," Marcus continued, his eyes distant with memory. "Every time I turned the key, I felt like I was driving into tomorrow. You gave me permission to believe in things that didn't exist yet." That evening, Elon found himself unable to shake Marcus's words. Somewhere in his relentless pursuit of market dominance and production targets, he had forgotten that Tesla had never been just about cars. It had been about hope made tangible, about the audacious belief that individuals could reshape the world through nothing more than determination and imagination. The idea to document these stories emerged from his conversation with Saxon over dinner. His son, now comfortable enough to offer suggestions rather than simply agreeing with everything his father said, proposed something that was both simple and revolutionary. "What if we asked people to tell us their Tesla stories?" Saxon suggested, his 13-year-old voice carrying the innocent wisdom that often provides the clearest solutions. Like real stories from real people about what it meant to them. The project began modestly, with Saxon wielding an iPhone like a professional documentarian, while Elon conducted interviews in the Tesla showroom. The stories that emerged were unexpectedly moving. A grandmother who had driven cross-country in her Model 3 to prove to her granddaughter that age was no barrier to adventure. A young father who had taught his son about environmental responsibility through their shared ritual of charging their car with solar panels. A retired teacher who had saved for years to afford a Tesla because she wanted her last car to represent hope rather than habit. Each story added another layer to Elon's evolving understanding of what he had built. These weren't just customers, they were co-conspirators in a vision of the future that he had almost forgotten in his obsession with quarterly earnings and production efficiency. The photo albums his father brought from a family storage unit contained treasures that Elon had forgotten existed. There was May at 25, holding baby Elon while standing beside their first car, her smile radiant with the particular joy of someone who believes the future holds infinite possibility. There she was again at 30, modeling for a local photographer while simultaneously reviewing engineering textbooks for her nutrition degree. "She never stopped learning," Errol said softly, pointing to a picture of May surrounded by scientific journals and cooking magazines. Even when money was tight, even when the babies were crying, she always believed there was something new to discover. Looking at these images, Elon felt a grief he had been avoiding for years. Not just for his mother's current condition, but for all the conversations they had never had, all the wisdom she had accumulated that he had been too busy to receive. Robert's suggestion about a book felt like a natural evolution of their theatrical collaboration. "The play showed people who you are," he explained during one of their regular walks along the Malibu shore. "A book could show them how you got there. All these stories, all these connections, they deserve to be preserved." The discovery of his mother's journals happened by accident while searching through boxes of family documents for the book project. May's handwriting, still elegant despite the decades, filled page after page with observations that revealed a philosophical depth Elon had never fully appreciated. "Today Elon asked me why the sky is blue," read one entry from 1975. "I told him about light and wavelengths, but what I really wanted to say was that the sky is blue because the world needs beauty, and beauty is God's way of reminding us that there's more to existence than what we can measure or control." Another entry from years later, watching the children sleep, I'm struck by how much faith parenthood requires. We bring these souls into the world without knowing what storms they'll face, what mountains they'll have to climb. All we can do is love them fiercely and teach them to believe in their own capacity for good. Reading these private reflections felt like discovering a new dimension of the woman who had shaped his earliest understanding of possibility. May hadn't just been his mother. She had been a philosopher, a dreamer, a quiet revolutionary who had believed that changing the world began with changing how we see it. Grimes's return happened on a Tuesday afternoon that had started like any other. She appeared at his office door carrying a leather-bound volume of poetry he had loaned her months before, her presence both familiar and strange after their period of separation. "I wanted to return this personally," she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to protect their own heart. "And to see how you're doing. Really doing." Their conversation stretched into evening, flowing with the ease of people who had once known each other intimately and were curious about who they had become in the interim. Elon found himself speaking with an honesty that would have been impossible during their relationship, describing his journey from the heart attack to the wedding to the growing understanding that success without connection was just elaborate solitude. "You seem different," Grimes observed, her artist's eye noting changes that went deeper than appearance. "More present, like you finally stopped running from something." "I think I was running from myself," Elon admitted. "From the person I was before I decided who I had to become." The cooking lessons with Saxon began as a practical matter, but evolved into something approaching sacred ritual. Using recipes they had found in May's journals, father and son worked together to recreate dishes from their family's past. Traditional South African bobo tie, the Sunday roast that had anchored their weekly gatherings, the special birthday cake recipe that May had adjusted over the years to accommodate each child's preferences. "Grandma used to let me lick the spoon," Saxon said, watching Elon measure ingredients with the same precision he brought to engineering specifications. She said the cook's privilege was the first taste. These culinary archaeological expeditions revealed unexpected layers of family history. Each recipe came with stories. The dinner party where May had improvised a dessert when the oven broke, the holiday meal that had brought reconciliation after a family argument, the simple Tuesday night pasta that had somehow become legendary in their household mythology. The installation of the customer story wall in the Tesla showroom transformed the space from a sterile retail environment into something approaching a community memorial. Photographs and testimonials covered an entire wall, creating a visual representation of the human impact behind the corporate statistics. "This is what we actually built," Elon told his employees during the wall's unveiling. "Not just cars, but connections. Not just transportation, but transformation." Errol's suggestion about daily letters to May emerged from his own practice of writing to his wife each evening, documenting the day's events and his feelings about their shared journey through her illness. "It doesn't matter if she understands every word," his father explained. "Love isn't just about communication, it's about consistency. About showing up every day, even when showing up is hard." Elon embraced this practice with the dedication he had once reserved for product development. Each evening, he would sit at his kitchen table and write to his mother about his day, his thoughts, his gradual rediscovery of what mattered most. The letters became a form of meditation, forcing him to slow down and reflect on experiences he might otherwise have rushed past. The visit to his grandmother's grave represented a pilgrimage he had been avoiding for years. Standing beside the weather headstone with Saxon at his side, Elon felt a connection to family history that extended beyond his immediate experience. "Tell me about her," Saxon requested, his young voice serious with genuine curiosity. The stories that followed painted a picture of a woman who had faced Depression-era hardships with humor and determination, who had taught her daughter that education was the one thing no one could take away, who had believed that every setback was just preparation for an even greater comeback. The tree planting ceremony at Sunset Manor became an impromptu celebration involving staff, residents, and family members. They chose a young oak tree, something that would grow slowly but surely, providing shade and beauty for generations to come. May watched from her wheelchair, her expression peaceful, as she observed the ritual without necessarily understanding its significance. "This will still be growing long after we're gone," Elon told Saxon as they patted soil around the sapling's roots. "That's what love does. It keeps growing even when we can't tend it directly." The chapter's final scene took place in May's room at Sunset Manor, with late afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the newly planted tree. Elon sat beside his mother's bed, holding one of his letters in hands that no longer trembled with impatience. "Dear Mom," he read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of decades and the hope of reconciliation. "Today, Saxon and I made your bow tie recipe, and for a moment, I could smell Sunday dinners and hear your laughter in the kitchen. I want you to know that everything beautiful I've ever built started with a dream you helped me believe was possible." May's eyes tracked his voice even when the words might have been meaningless, and sometimes, just sometimes, she would smile, as if recognizing the love that connected past and present in ways that transcended memory or disease. The words began disappearing like stars at dawn, fading so gradually that Elon almost didn't notice at first. May's sentences grew shorter, then fragmented, then dissolved entirely into gestures and expressions that carried more weight than speech ever had. Her eyes, still bright despite the fog that surrounded them, became her primary language, speaking volumes in glances that lingered a moment longer than necessary. The transformation was both heartbreaking and beautiful to witness. Where once his mother had filled rooms with animated conversation and laughter that could charm strangers into instant friendship, she now inhabited a quieter space, one where communication happened through the subtle architecture of presence rather than the busy construction of words. During one afternoon visit, as Elon sat reading aloud from a morning news in a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of their old routine, May suddenly reached out and took his hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers interlacing with his in a gesture that spoke of recognition that transcended the boundaries of damaged memory. They sat like that for nearly an hour, mother and son connected by touch rather than conversation, and Elon discovered that this wordless communication carried an intimacy he had never experienced during all their years of verbal exchange. Her hand in his spoke of forgiveness for his long absences, of pride in the man he had become, of love that persisted even when the mind could no longer organize it into coherent expression. "I understand, Mom," he whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure what he understood, only that understanding had arrived without explanation like grace. Saxon's artistic response to his grandmother's condition revealed depths of emotional intelligence that continued to surprise Elon. The boy began carrying a sketchbook to Sunset Manor, capturing moments in simple lines and gentle colors. May's profile as she gazed out the window, her hands folded in her lap like sleeping birds, the way afternoon light caught the silver in her hair and transformed it into something approaching luminescence. "This one's my favorite," Saxon said, showing his father a drawing of May smiling at something invisible to the viewer. She was watching a bird outside, and for a minute, she looked exactly like she does in the old photos. The decision to frame Saxon's drawing and place it prominently in his Tesla office felt like a quiet revolution. Where once the walls had been dominated by awards and achievement certificates, now his mother's gentle smile presided over board meetings and strategic planning sessions, reminding everyone present that success without love was simply organized emptiness. Robert's enthusiasm for the exhibition project brought together threads that had been weaving through their lives for months. The time in Tesla became more than a memorial. It evolved into a celebration of how individual stories intersect with larger dreams, how family history informs professional vision, how the past continues to shape the future even when memory itself begins to fade. The exhibition space, carved out of the Tesla factory's administrative wing, became a pilgrimage site for employees and visitors alike. Display cases held artifacts that told the story of dreams made manifest, May's handwritten recipes beside technical specifications for the first Roadster, family photographs arranged chronologically with Tesla's product evolution, letters from customers sharing their stories alongside design sketches that had evolved into revolutionary transportation. "Look at this," Robert said, arranging a display that juxtaposed May's journal entry about teaching her children to believe in impossible things with newspaper clippings from Tesla's early skeptical press coverage. This is where it all started, with a mother who refused to let her son accept limitations. The day they brought May to see the exhibition required careful planning and gentle preparation, but her response justified every effort involved. Wheeled slowly through the space, she touched objects with the reverence of someone encountering sacred relics. When she reached the display case containing her old cooking apron, the one she had worn during countless Sunday dinners, her fingers pressed against the glass with sudden urgency. "This was yours, wasn't it, Mom?" Elon asked, though the question was rhetorical. The emotion in her eyes provided all the answer he needed. Opening her journal to a random page, Elon began reading aloud. "The secret to raising children who change the world is teaching them that the world needs changing, but that the changing starts with love. Everything else, the intelligence, the determination, the vision, grows from that foundation." May's silence as he read wasn't empty. It was full of presence, dense with attention that transcended the need for verbal response. She listened with her entire being, and Elon found himself understanding that this might be the purest form of communication they had ever shared. The reconciliation with his own childhood happened gradually, like archaeological excavation that reveals treasures buried beneath layers of accumulated ambition and corporate urgency. He began remembering not just what he had accomplished as a boy, but who he had been. Curious rather than driven, imaginative rather than strategic, open to wonder in ways that adult responsibilities had gradually trained out of him. His own journal writing began as an echo of his mother's practice, but evolved into something distinctly his own. Where May had written with poetic reflection, Elon found himself documenting the daily miracle of rediscovering what mattered most. His entries captured moments that would have been invisible to his previous self, the way Saxon's laugh changed when he was genuinely delighted versus merely polite, the subtle shifts in his father's expressions as Errol navigated his own aging process, the profound peace that settled over him during wordless visits with his mother. "Today I realized that I spent decades trying to reach the future and almost missed the present," he wrote one evening. But the present is where love lives, where connection happens, where the real work of being human gets done. Errol's increasing mobility challenges brought new opportunities for tenderness and practical care. Elon found himself researching wheelchair ramps and bathroom modifications with the same intensity he had once applied to rocket propulsion systems. The adaptations to his father's living space became projects of love rather than obligation, each accessibility improvement representing another way to honor the man who had supported his impossible dreams when no one else believed they could become reality. The rhythm of family life slowed to accommodate these new realities, and Elon discovered that slower didn't mean lesser. Extended silences during visits became comfortable rather than awkward. Conversations measured in minutes rather than hours carried more weight than the rapid-fire exchanges that had characterized his business relationships. The most significant change in his behavior was also the most symbolic. During visits to his mother, Elon began leaving his smartphone in the car. The device that had once seemed essential to his survival now felt like an intrusion on moments that demanded complete presence. "You know, Dad," Saxon observed during one of their drives home from Sunset Manor, "you're starting to remind me of Grandpa. The way you listen now, the way you're not always thinking about the next thing." The comment struck Elon with unexpected force. To be compared to his father, to be seen as inheriting Errol's capacity for patience and steady presence, felt like receiving an honor he had never thought to seek. The tears that came were tears of gratitude for recognition he hadn't known he needed. "Is that a good thing?" he asked his son, though he already knew the answer from the warmth in Saxon's voice. "It's the best thing," Saxon replied with the certainty that only children possess when speaking fundamental truths. The transformation in Tesla's corporate culture happened so gradually that it took Maria, his assistant, several weeks to identify what had changed. The urgent edge that had characterized every interaction had softened into something more sustainable. Meetings that once felt like military briefings now included space for genuine questions and collaborative problem-solving. "It's like you've given us permission to be human at work," James from production observed during a team meeting. "We're still getting everything done, but it doesn't feel like we're sacrificing our souls to do it." The chapter's final image crystallized everything that had evolved in Elon's understanding of love and time and presence. He sat beside May's wheelchair in the garden at Sunset Manor, both of them facing west as the sun began its daily descent toward the horizon. Neither spoke, but the quality of their shared silence was rich with mutual recognition and acceptance. May's hand rested in his, her breathing steady and peaceful as color spread across the sky in shades of gold and rose and deepening purple. For the first time in his adult life, Elon wasn't thinking about tomorrow's challenges or yesterday's regrets. He was completely, utterly present in a moment that required nothing from him except the willingness to witness beauty and share it with someone he loved. The sun set without fanfare, as it had for billions of years before human beings learned to mark time with achievements and deadlines. And as darkness gently settled over the garden, Elon understood that he had finally learned the most important lesson his mother had ever tried to teach him: that love doesn't need words to be complete, doesn't need explanations to be understood, doesn't need forever to be perfect. It only needs presence. And presence, he had discovered, was something he finally knew how to give. The phone call came at 3 a.m, slicing through Elon's dreams with the sharp urgency reserved for life's most unwelcome announcements. Errol's voice, usually steady despite his advancing years, carried a tremor that spoke of fear barely held in check. "I can't move my left arm," he said simply, the words delivered with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had spent a lifetime solving mechanical problems and now found himself confronting one that couldn't be fixed with tools or determination. The stroke had been minor by medical standards, but its impact on their family constellation felt enormous. Suddenly, the man who had been Elon's anchor of stability, the steady presence who had anchored their family through decades of change and challenge, needed the kind of care that required complete reorganization of priorities and schedules. Moving Errol into his home felt like completing a circle that had been decades in the making. The guest bedroom was transformed into a careful balance of independence and safety. Rails installed beside the bed, medications organized in weekly dispensers, a baby monitor that allowed Elon to respond instantly to any nighttime emergencies. Saxon embraced his grandfather's presence with the adaptability that seemed to be his superpower. The boy created schedules for medication reminders, learned to prepare the simple meals that accommodated Errol's dietary restrictions, and developed an intuitive understanding of when his grandfather needed assistance versus when he needed the dignity of struggling through tasks independently. "Grandpa likes it when I read the engineering magazines to him," Saxon reported during one of their evening planning sessions. Even though he can't hold them steady anymore, his brain still wants to know how things work. The adjustment required Elon to restructure not just his daily routine, but his fundamental relationship with control. Tesla's operations, which he had micromanaged for years, were gradually transferred to the capable hands of his leadership team. Maria coordinated with department heads to ensure that decisions could be made without his constant input. James took greater responsibility for production oversight. The company didn't collapse. It evolved, developing resilience through distributed leadership rather than depending entirely on one person's relentless attention. "You know," Maria observed during one of their brief check-ins, "we're actually making better decisions now that we're not waiting for your approval on everything. You trained us well. You just forgot to trust us." The recognition from the Tesla Employees Association came as a complete surprise. The award ceremony, held in the same auditorium where they had staged Robert's play, felt like a family gathering rather than a corporate event. When they called his name and he walked to the podium, Elon saw faces that represented not just professional relationships, but genuine human connections forged through shared purpose and mutual respect. "This doesn't belong to me," he said, holding the engraved plaque with trembling hands. "Everything meaningful I've ever accomplished started with a mother who taught me to dream beyond limitations, and a father who showed me that love is built through daily dedication. This belongs to them, and to all of you who believe that impossible things could become real." The tears that followed weren't tears of embarrassment, but of overwhelming gratitude for the recognition that success without love was hollow, but success built on love could transform everyone it touched. Saxon's school presentation about invisible inheritances provided another lens through which Elon could examine the transformation of his understanding. The boy stood before his 7th grade class with the confident presence of someone who had learned that authentic stories carry more power than impressive statistics. "My dad built electric cars," Saxon began, "but what he really inherited from my grandma was the ability to see what could be instead of just accepting what is. And what I inherited from him is the understanding that the most important innovations happen in people's hearts, not just in their garages." The project traced the connections between May's philosophical journals and Tesla's mission statement, between Errol's patient engineering approach and the company's commitment to sustainable solutions, between family dinner conversations and corporate values that prioritized long-term vision over short-term profits. Mrs. Rodriguez, Saxon's teacher, extended an invitation that would have terrified the old Elon, but energized the person he was becoming. "Would you be willing to speak to our students about innovation and family? They're fascinated by Saxon's presentation, and I think hearing from you directly would be incredibly meaningful." The classroom visit became an exercise in translation, converting complex business concepts into stories that 7th graders could understand and relate to. Elon found himself talking about failure as education, about the importance of asking why not instead of why, about the courage required to build something that doesn't exist yet. "The coolest thing about my job," he told the wide-eyed students, "isn't the rockets or the cars. It's working with people who believe that tomorrow can be better than today and who are willing to work really hard to make that happen." The questions that followed revealed a hunger for authentic mentorship that extended far beyond his son's classroom. These young minds, eager for guidance but skeptical of empty promises, responded to honesty about both success and struggle. Their enthusiasm planted the seed for an idea that would eventually become a comprehensive program offering free coding and engineering classes to underserved youth in the community. May's decline accelerated with frightening suddenness, her body finally succumbing to the accumulated toll of fighting a disease that had been stealing pieces of her for years. The fevers came in waves, leaving her smaller and more fragile after each episode, as if each battle with illness diminished not just her strength, but her physical presence in the world. During one particularly difficult night, as Elon sat beside her hospital-style bed that had been moved into the living room of Sunset Manor, her fever broke with dramatic suddenness. For a moment, her eyes cleared with the startling lucidity that sometimes emerges just before dawn, and she looked directly at him with recognition that transcended her usual confusion. "Obrigada," she whispered in Portuguese, the language of her heart that had emerged despite years of speaking primarily English. "Thank you." The word was barely audible, but it carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of gratitude and love. That single word echoed in Elon's consciousness for days afterward, seeming to contain acknowledgement not just for his recent presence and care, but for the man he had finally learned to become. In her simple thanks, he heard forgiveness for his years of absence, recognition of his transformation, and blessing for whatever time remained to them. Robert's decision to relocate closer to the family felt like the return of a brother who had been traveling too long in distant countries. The actor purchased a modest apartment within walking distance of Sunset Manor, establishing routines that included daily visits with May and regular dinners with Elon's newly reconfigured household. "I've spent decades playing other people's stories," Robert explained one evening over a meal that Saxon had prepared with careful attention to both Errol's dietary restrictions and everyone's emotional needs. But this story, our story, feels like the most important role I've ever played. The letters that Errol began writing to each of his grandchildren required tremendous physical effort, but seemed to energize him in ways that medical interventions couldn't match. His handwriting, once bold and precise, had become shaky and uncertain, but the love that motivated each word was unmistakable. Reading these letters privately before sharing them with their intended recipients, Elon discovered facets of his father's emotional intelligence that decades of daily interaction had somehow failed to reveal. Errol wrote about mistakes he had made as a young father, about dreams he had sacrificed for practical necessities, about the profound joy he had found in watching his children exceed every expectation he had dared to hold. To Saxon, read one letter: "You have your father's brilliant mind and your grandmother's generous heart. But more than that, you have something entirely your own, the wisdom to see that being smart isn't the same as being kind, and that the world needs both. Don't ever let anyone convince you that you have to choose between success and goodness. The greatest achievements come from combining both." Another letter, addressed to his other grandchildren, spoke of resilience and hope. "Life will test your dreams in ways you can't imagine yet. There will be days when giving up seems like the only reasonable choice. But remember that your grandfather built impossible things by refusing to accept that they were impossible, and your grandmother loved impossible people by believing they could become better versions of themselves." The evening ritual of reading these letters aloud had become a form of family communion, connecting past wisdom with present hope, acknowledging both the weight of inheritance and the freedom to create something entirely new. As Saxon's voice filled the living room with his grandfather's carefully chosen words, Elon felt the profound peace that comes from understanding that love doesn't end with death, doesn't disappear with disease, doesn't diminish when shared freely. It multiplies, creating legacies that extend far beyond individual lifetimes, touching lives that haven't even begun yet. "The greatest gift I can give you," Errol had written in his shaky but determined handwriting, "is the certainty that you are loved exactly as you are, and that this love will continue long after I'm gone. Carry it with you, share it freely, and remember that every act of kindness is a letter to the future." The morning arrived with the deceptive normalcy that often accompanies life's most profound moments. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Elon went through the familiar ritual of preparing morning coffee, his movements automatic and peaceful after months of learning to find contentment in simple routines. The aroma of freshly ground beans filled the air, mixing with the sounds of Saxon getting ready for school and Errol slowly making his way to the breakfast table. The phone rang just as Elon was reaching for his favorite mug, the one Saxon had given him last Christmas, with "World's Most Present Dad" printed in uneven letters that made it more precious than any corporate award he had ever received. "Mr. Musk." The voice belonged to Linda, the head nurse at Sunset Manor, and something in her gentle tone made the coffee cup freeze halfway to Elon's lips. "I'm so sorry to have to tell you this, but your mother passed away peacefully about an hour ago. She went in her sleep, very quietly, with no distress." The world didn't stop in the dramatic way that movies suggest it should. Instead, it seemed to slow down, each second stretching like honey as Elon processed words that his mind had been preparing for but his heart had refused to accept. He set the coffee mug down carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled, as if precision could somehow hold the grief at bay. "Thank you," he heard himself saying, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. "We'll be there soon." When he hung up the phone, Elon remained standing in his kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary evidence of a morning that had started like any other but would never be forgotten. The coffee continued brewing, filling the silence with its familiar gurgling, while somewhere deep inside him, something fundamental shifted and settled into a new configuration. He sat down at the kitchen table and cried. Not the dramatic sobs of movie grief, but the quiet tears of someone saying goodbye to love that had shaped every important decision he had ever made. They were tears of loss, but also of gratitude for having been loved so completely by someone who had believed in his impossible dreams when the rest of the world saw only an eccentric boy who talked too much about rockets and electric cars. The drive to Sunset Manor felt like a pilgrimage through familiar territory that had suddenly become foreign. Saxon sat beside him in uncharacteristic silence, his 13-year-old mind processing the reality of death in ways that would probably take years to fully understand. In the back seat, Errol gazed out the window with the distant expression of someone traveling through internal landscapes that no one else could map. May looked smaller in death, but also somehow more essential, as if the disease that had been stealing pieces of her for years had finally been forced to surrender, leaving behind only the core of who she had always been. Her face wore an expression of such profound peace that Elon found himself believing, for the first time in his rigorously scientific life, that death might not be an ending, but a transformation into something beyond his understanding. Errol's goodbye was heartbreaking in its tenderness. The man who had remarried his wife just months earlier approached her bedside with the careful dignity of someone completing a sacred ritual. He took her hand in both of his weathered fingers intertwining with hers one final time, and whispered words in Afrikaans that Elon couldn't understand but felt in his bones. "Touchens my liefling," Errol murmured, his voice breaking on words that carried 60 years of shared dreams and daily devotions. "Thank you for teaching me that love is not about time, but about depth." The moment when Saxon hugged his father marked a turning point in their relationship that would resonate for years to come. For the first time, the boy saw his father not as an authority figure or corporate titan, but as someone who could be wounded, who needed comfort, who was brave enough to be vulnerable in front of the people he loved most. "It's okay to be sad, Dad," Saxon whispered, his young arms surprisingly strong around his father's shoulders. "Grandma wouldn't want you to pretend you're not." The visitation at Morrison Funeral Home became an impromptu celebration of a life that had touched far more people than Elon had ever realized. The modest room filled with faces from every era of May's journey, former modeling colleagues who remembered her grace and professionalism, nutrition clients whose lives she had transformed through patient education, neighbors who had been recipients of her legendary dinner party hospitality, and Tesla employees who had experienced her warmth during company events. The display boards that Robert had helped arrange told the story of a life lived with intentional beauty. Photographs spanning 7 decades showed May as a young bride, a devoted mother, a successful professional, and finally, as the beloved matriarch whose influence had shaped not just her immediate family, but everyone fortunate enough to enter her orbit. The tribute that Robert read had been written by Elon during the sleepless hours after her death, when grief had stripped away his usual corporate language and left him with nothing but raw truth and profound gratitude. "My mother taught me that the most important innovations happen not in laboratories or boardrooms, but in the human heart." Robert's voice carried through the room with theatrical precision, softened by genuine emotion. "She showed me that intelligence without kindness is just cleverness, that success without love is just sophisticated emptiness, and that the future we build together is always more meaningful than any achievement we could accomplish alone." The turnout surprised even those who had known May well. The community had responded to her passing as if losing a beloved family member, filling the funeral home beyond capacity and spilling out into the parking lot where people stood quietly sharing memories and offering mutual comfort. Elon's reading of his final letter to his mother became the emotional centerpiece of the service, his voice steady despite the tears that flowed freely as he spoke words meant for her ears alone, but somehow appropriate for everyone who had loved her. "Dear Mom," he read, "I spent so many years trying to reach the future that I almost missed the present you taught me to cherish. Thank you for believing in my impossible dreams, for forgiving my long absences, for loving me exactly as I was while inspiring me to become who I was meant to be. Every beautiful thing I ever built started with a seed you planted in my heart." Saxon's gesture of placing his drawing in the casket moved everyone present to tears. The sketch, done in colored pencils with the careful attention to detail that had become his signature, showed May sitting in her garden, surrounded by flowers and butterflies, her face radiant with the joy that had characterized her approach to life even in its most difficult moments. "So she can remember what she looked like when she was happy," Saxon explained simply, his words carrying a wisdom that transcended his years. Errol's expression of gratitude to the gathered mourners revealed the depth of grace that had sustained him through decades of loving someone whose mind was slowly disappearing. His voice, though weakened by stroke and weighted with grief, carried absolute clarity as he thanked everyone for being part of May's story. "She would have been overwhelmed by this outpouring of love," he said, his words careful but strong. But not surprised. May always believed that love multiplies when it's shared, and today you've proven her right. The decision to host a dinner at his home following the burial service felt like the most natural way to honor May's memory. The menu consisted entirely of her recipes, prepared by Saxon and Elon with the careful attention to detail that had characterized her own cooking. The aroma of bobotie and milk tart filled the house, creating an atmosphere that seemed to welcome her presence even in her physical absence. The dining room table, extended to its maximum length and surrounded by borrowed chairs, became a sanctuary where grief and celebration intermingled naturally. Stories about May flowed as freely as the wine, each memory adding another layer to the collective portrait of a woman who had made every meal an expression of love, every gathering an opportunity for connection. "She taught us all to love around this table," observed Mrs. Patterson, May's longtime neighbor whose eyes were bright with tears and laughter simultaneously. Food was never just nutrition for May. It was her way of saying, "You matter, you belong, you are cherished." Throughout the evening, Elon found himself feeling his mother's presence not as a ghost or memory, but as something more fundamental, a set of values and approaches to life that had become so integrated into his being that they would continue influencing his choices long after grief had softened into gratitude. Errol sat quietly through most of the dinner, his eyes moving from face to face as he absorbed the warmth and affection that surrounded May's memory. When people shared their favorite stories about her, he would nod or smile, occasionally adding details that enhanced their recollections, but mainly serving as a witness to the impact his wife had made on so many lives. As the evening wound down and guests began their gentle departures, Elon found himself standing alone in his backyard, looking up at stars that seemed brighter than usual in the clear night sky. The house behind him glowed with warm light, and the sounds of Saxon helping to clean dishes while Robert regaled Errol with gentle stories designed to ease the transition from celebration back to the reality of loss. "Obrigado," Elon whispered to the darkness, using the Portuguese word his mother had spoken during one of their last coherent conversations. "Thank you for everything you gave me, everything you taught me, everything you believed I could become." The house settled around him with the comfortable sounds of family life continuing despite profound change, and Elon understood that this was perhaps the greatest gift his mother had left him. The knowledge that love persists even when the beloved is gone, that the best way to honor the dead is to live more fully, and that every goodbye contains within it the seeds of all the hellos yet to come. The construction of the May wing had taken 8 months, but the vision had been crystallizing in Elon's mind since the day they laid his mother to rest. What emerged was something unprecedented in corporate architecture, a space that honored memory not with marble monuments or bronze plaques, but with the living celebration of human creativity and connection. The wing occupied the entire eastern section of the Tesla facility, flooded with natural light from skylights that had been designed to capture the quality of illumination that had always made May's face luminous in photographs. The main hall featured comfortable seating arrangements that encouraged conversation rather than corporate presentations, with walls lined by display cases that rotated monthly exhibitions of local artists, student projects, and community achievements. "It doesn't feel like a factory anymore," observed Maria during the wing's dedication ceremony. "It feels like coming home to a place you've never been before." Saxon had embraced his role as unofficial youth coordinator with the same enthusiasm he had once reserved for video games and skateboarding. At 14 now, he moved through the space with easy confidence, helping elderly visitors navigate the monthly technology workshops, translating between languages during the international cultural exchanges, and serving as a bridge between his father's corporate world and the community that had embraced their family story. "The coolest thing," Saxon told a journalist during one interview, "is watching my dad discover that success isn't about building walls around what you've achieved. It's about opening doors for other people to achieve things too." Errol's Sunday afternoon presence had become as reliable as the changing seasons, though his participation had necessarily evolved to accommodate his physical limitations. Seated in his wheelchair near the wing's central garden, he served as an informal grandfather figure to visiting children and a repository of stories for anyone curious about the early days of Tesla's development. "Your father was the most stubborn child I've ever known," he would tell fascinated young visitors, his eyes twinkling with mischief. If he told him something was impossible, he'd spend the next month figuring out 3 different ways to prove you wrong. Robert's new theatrical project had emerged organically from his observations of the intergenerational connections flourishing in the May Wing. The Stories We Keep featured senior community members sharing pivotal moments from their lives with younger actors who then interpreted these experiences through performance, creating bridges between past wisdom and present understanding. "Growing old isn't about losing relevance," Robert explained to the packed auditorium during the play's opening night. "It's about becoming a living library of experience that younger generations can access if they're wise enough to ask the right questions." The unexpected development of Elon's relationship with 10-year-old Marcus Rivera from the neighborhood had begun during one of the wing's Saturday science workshops. The boy, whose single mother worked double shifts to support their small family, had lingered after the other children left, asking questions about electric motors with the intensity that Elon recognized from his own childhood. "Could you build a car that runs on lightning?" Marcus had asked with complete seriousness, his dark eyes bright with possibility. "Well," Elon had replied, settling into the patient teaching mode that had become second nature, "let's think about what lightning actually is, and then we can explore whether that energy could power a vehicle." The relationship had deepened gradually through shared experiments and casual conversations that revealed Marcus's hunger for mentorship and Elon's growing capacity for nurturing young minds without overwhelming them with his own ambitions. When Marcus's mother mentioned during a parent conference that the boy had never had a stable male figure in his life, Elon's offer to serve as an unofficial godfather had felt as natural as breathing. The strengthening bond between Elon and Saxon had become the foundation upon which all other relationships were built. Father and son had developed rituals that honored both their individual personalities and their shared commitment to being present for each other. Wednesday evening cooking sessions where they experimented with recipes from May's journals. Saturday morning runs through the neighborhood where conversation flowed as naturally as their synchronized breathing. And Sunday dinners that often included extended family and friends who had become part of their chosen constellation. "You know what's different about Dad now?" Saxon confided to Robert during one of their regular conversations. "He actually listens to my answers when he asks me questions. Before, it felt like he was just waiting for me to stop talking, so he could get back to work." The Social Responsibility Award from the California Business Council had been unexpected, recognizing Tesla's transformation from a purely profit-driven corporation into something approaching a community anchor. Elon's acceptance speech, delivered in the same auditorium where his parents had renewed their vows, focused not on corporate achievements, but on the simple recognition that businesses exist within communities and therefore have obligations that extend beyond shareholder profits. "My mother taught me that intelligence without kindness is just sophisticated selfishness," he told the assembled business leaders. She would have been proud not of our financial success, but of our growing understanding that the best innovations serve human needs rather than just market demands. The repeated acquisition offers, each more substantial than the last, had become almost routine interruptions to daily operations. Investment groups from around the world recognized that Tesla had evolved beyond automotive manufacturing into something more valuable and harder to quantify, a brand that represented authentic transformation, community engagement, and the integration of business success with social responsibility. They don't understand that we're not selling a company anymore, Elon explained to his board of directors during one meeting where the latest offer topped $12 billion. We're stewarding a community. This place belongs to everyone who has invested their hopes in what we're building together. The magazine article by journalist Elena Rodriguez had started as a routine business profile but evolved into something more personal and profound. The bride's son explored Elon's transformation through the lens of his parents' love story, examining how witnessing their renewed commitment had catalyzed his own journey toward emotional authenticity. In an era when corporate leaders are often celebrated for their ruthless efficiency and single-minded focus, Rodriguez wrote, Elon Musk represents something rarer and perhaps more valuable: the courage to evolve, to admit that success without love is hollow, and to rebuild one's life around principles that can't be measured in quarterly reports. The framed article had found its place in Elon's home office, not displayed prominently like his corporate awards, but tucked between family photographs where he could see it during quiet moments of reflection. The title itself had moved him to tears when he first read it, recognizing in those 3 words an identity he had never claimed but had always carried: the son of a woman whose love had been so generous that it continued shaping lives long after her death. The cemetery visits had become monthly pilgrimages that Saxon approached with the solemnity of someone who understood that grief and gratitude could coexist in the same space. They would arrive with flowers from a May Wing's garden and homemade cookies prepared using recipes from her journals, creating small celebrations of memory rather than monuments to loss. Dear Mom, Elon would read from letters he had written during the weeks between visits, his voice carrying easily in the peaceful quiet of the memorial garden. Saxon learned to make your chocolate chip cookies this month, and I think he's actually improved on your recipe, though I'll never tell him that because some things should remain sacred family secrets. The poetry in May's journals had been Errol's discovery, verses written in quiet moments between the daily demands of raising children and building careers. Her words revealed an artistic sensibility that had been expressed through nurturing rather than formal creative pursuits, but which had created beauty that endured beyond her physical presence. Listen to this one, Errol would say, his voice growing stronger whenever he read his wife's words. She wrote this when Elon was about Saxon's age. The boy builds rockets in his mind before breakfast, colonizes Mars during math class, and still believes that tomorrow will arrive wearing the clothes he designed for it. How do I teach him that dreams are fragile without crushing the spirit that makes them possible? The sense of completion that had settled over their family felt not like an ending, but like a new beginning, one built on foundations strong enough to support whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. Memory had transformed from source of pain into wellspring of strength, and May's influence had evolved from absence into presence that could be felt in every act of kindness and courage they chose to express. The restaurant meal had been Saxon's idea, a simple celebration of nothing more significant than a Tuesday evening when homework was finished and father and son found themselves hungry at the same time. Sitting in a booth at the neighborhood Italian place they had discovered during one of their evening walks, Elon felt something he had spent decades chasing through corporate achievements and technological breakthroughs: complete contentment with a moment that required nothing more than presence. The food was good but not extraordinary, the service friendly but efficient, the atmosphere busy with the comfortable sounds of families and friends sharing meals and conversation. Watching other tables, Elon recognized his former self in the fathers who checked their phones between bites, who answered calls during their children's stories, who seemed always to be rushing towards some more important engagement. "You know what, Dad?" Saxon said, reaching across the table to place his hand over his father's, his 14-year-old voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed transformation firsthand. "Grandma would be really proud of who you've become. You're a good son." The words settled into Elon's heart with the weight of benediction, carrying forgiveness for all the years when he hadn't known how to be present, gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment, and hope for all the conversations and connections still waiting to unfold. And as he smiled at his son across a table in an ordinary restaurant on an unremarkable Tuesday evening, Elon understood that this was what his mother had always been trying to teach him, that the most profound achievements happen not in boardrooms or laboratories, but in the quiet moments when we choose love over efficiency, presence over productivity, and connection over conquest. The smile that spread across his face was not the practiced expression of corporate success, but the genuine joy of someone who had finally learned that the most important innovations happen in the human heart. In the end, it wasn't about grand gestures or perfect words. It was about presence, about learning to sit beside someone you love, even when they no longer remember your name, and knowing that love still lives there, quietly, steadily, in every meal shared, every memory rekindled, every hand held just a moment longer. If you were in his place, would you have stopped in time? Would you have heard the small voice beneath the noise? The one whispering that it's never too late to go back, to make amends, to say the things that waited too long. If this story moved something in you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel, give it a like, and share it